Hi and welcome to Cuaderno Reciclado. My name is Marifer. The name of this channel means recycled notebook. And if you look around this channel, you might notice that I mainly post videos in Spanish. But I thought I might start posting a few in English, specifically reviews about books published originally in Spanish. And today's book needs no more praise or hype, but it is one of my favorite books, and it's 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel García Márquez. This, of course, is the Spanish edition. In case you speak Spanish, I have another video in which I filmed a review in Spanish, and I will leave the link below, and also a couple of lectures by Juan Villoro, a Mexican author, about this book that I found very interesting in case you want to watch them after you read the book. Gabriel García Márquez is a Colombian author, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1982, although this book was published in 1967, and it is considered to be his masterpiece. It is a very well-loved book, not only in Colombia or Latin America, but around the world, because it is now in many lists of the best books of all time. It is perhaps the poster child for magical realism, although this is not one of the works that originated this literary movement, which consists of presenting fantastical elements as if they were ordinary or in a matter-of-fact tone. In the early 60s, García Márquez moved to Mexico City with his family, and that is where he wrote this book. And according to the legend, although there are several versions because apparently he liked to sort of confuse the people, confuse interviewers when they asked him about how he first thought of writing this book. He enjoyed embellishing his own myth. So he says that one day he was driving to Acapulco with his family, and on the road the idea sort of appeared to him. I think he even said that the first phrase of the book appeared in his mind, and apparently he turned right away and went back to Mexico City and started writing this novel. He spent about a year and a half writing this book, a time in which the family didn't have a lot of money, so they received a lot of help from friends. They asked for a few loans, but it was all so he could focus on finishing this novel. And fortunately, it was a huge success from the start. I think it's because it manages to be both profound but also very accessible. I read once on a book review that the best books or the best novels are the ones that are about everything. And then also I watched a review of this book by a Spanish YouTuber. I'll leave the link in the description, in which he says that to explain why this is his favorite book, he once said that it's because it captures life. And I think it reminded me of what I read in the review, because I agree with both statements. I think in this novel you can find love, heartbreak, tragedy, adventure, comedy, war, death, corruption, really all the good and bad in life. One of the greatest things about this novel is definitely the writing. I think, well, I've never read any of the translations of this book, but I imagine they must be very good for it to be as successful in other languages as it is in the original. And I'm really in awe of all the translators who took the challenge of of translating this book, because I think it's deceptively simple, uh, but it also is very poetic, and I think Garcia Marquez likes to play with words. So I cannot imagine how hard that must have been to not only to translate but to convey, I guess, the rhythm of the phrases. But if you're interested in learning Spanish, honestly, I think it's worth it, so you can read it in the original language, because I think it's a beautifully written book. I heard once a quote by the French poet Baudelaire that says, "Always be a poet, even in prose." And I think that describes this book exactly. It's poetry in the form of prose. I think Garcia Marquez was not only very talented, but you could tell that there was a lot of work behind that. It's very hard to make something look easy. And well, by that time he had written many books beforehand. Also, he spent many years working as a journalist, and I think I imagine that the work behind every word here must have been immense. I honestly think that this book made me appreciate a lot more the beauty of the Spanish language. Now I'm going to mention a few plot points. So if you haven't read this book, please do. I think you're really missing out if you haven't. And then when you finish the book, come back and watch the next part. When I started reading this book, it did take me a while to get used to the style. And for that, I mean not only the magical realism part, but also the time jumps that happen throughout this novel, which you can see from the first phrase. And actually, I found out that the first phrase of this book, which I think is now one of the most famous first phrases in literature, was inspired by a phrase in Pedro Páramo by Juan, a book that I read when I was 15 and that I didn't understand at all. And actually, I'm now rereading it because it's a very important book in Mexico, so I really want to be able to understand it now. So the first phrase talks about something that happens actually towards the middle of the book, and then it brings us back to the present and sort of starts telling the story in a chronological way, kind of. So this tale begins with José Arcadio Buendía and Úrsula Iguarán, who are cousins that end up getting married, even though there's a curse in the family that says that any children born of a couple of relatives will have the tail of a pig. And at first, especially Ursula is very worried about this, so they decide not to consummate their marriage. But then Jose Arcadio starts getting made fun of in town, until one day he's had enough and he kills someone that was making fun of him. But then that guy starts showing up as a ghost to both of them, and he decides, Jose Arcadio decides that they have to leave town. So they leave and they start a new town called Macondo, which will be the setting for all this story. They do end up having kids. They have Jose Arcadio, Aureliano, Amaranta, and later they adopt Rebecca. From here on, we'll meet several generations of the Buendía family. And, well, it is, I think, kind of well known that the names are repeated many times in this novel. They usually name the children after their parents, which serves a purpose in the novel, but it's also something very common, I think, to most Latin American countries. So I think it's very representative of that tradition. But it's a good idea to start building your own family tree as you go, because it starts to get confusing at around the fourth generation, which I think it's also a purpose of the novel to to confuse you with all the names, apparently. But yeah, I did build my own family tree as I went along. And even though I think I remember the first generations a lot more than the later ones, it did help me throughout reading this novel. At one point, Ursula makes the observation that the Jose Arcadios and the Aurelianos tend to behave in similar ways. The Aurelianos tend to be more quiet and introspective, but very bright. And the Jose Arcadios tend to be more impulsive, but they're entrepreneurs, but they do, she says that they have a tragic sign. But I think we end up seeing that every member of this family sort of has a tragic sign, and a sign of solitude as well, as you could infer from the title of this novel. Now, of course, there were a few things that I didn't enjoy, two in particular. One is the issue of pedophilia, which I mentioned because I know that it shows up in some of his other works, which is a little concerning. And in here, we see it in the relationship of Aureliano and Remedios. So Aureliano, being a grown young man, says he falls in love with Remedios, who is a 9-year-old. And you can see at first that both families are confused about it, but in the end, they believe Aureliano when he says that he's really in love, so they end up getting married. And well, throughout this part, Remedios seems to be, first of all, like very happy before the marriage, like very excited about it. And afterwards, she also seems to be very happy in this new role as a wife, but she's a 9-year-old. And I think that if it had to be there, I think it would have been interesting to know how Remedios felt about it, because we never really know. We just read about how she seemed like, but we don't really know how she was feeling or what she was thinking, because I don't think a 9-year-old would be very happy with that situation. So yeah, I didn't really enjoy that part. And the other thing is the issue of consent, because in at least 2 times in this novel, a woman says no explicitly, and the guy thinks he convinces her, and then they end up having sex. And I think that doesn't really help with the current conversation about it. And of course, we have to remember that this book was written and published in the 60s. So of course the sensibilities have changed, but I still do think that it's, I don't know, I do like pointing out the differences of thought between now and then. even though I still think this is a masterpiece and this is one of my favorite books. But there are things that I can't help being, I guess, a woman in 2021 reading about this. It does make me uncomfortable. García Márquez took a lot of inspiration from his own life to write this novel, starting with the fact that he said that he wanted to write a book that sounded the way his grandmother spoke, the way his grandmother told him stories. And he also he adds a lot of details, like, for example, his sister ate dirt when she was a kid, and in here we see Rebecca eats dirt also when she's a kid. So little details like that. But he also gets inspiration from actual events, and one of them is the banana massacre that happened in Colombia in 1928, in which employees of the United Fruit Company, an American company that was in Colombia, these employees were in charge of cutting the banana trees, and they went on a strike to demand better working conditions. But they didn't find any sort of agreement, and the Colombian army got involved, and it indeed was a massacre. They killed, from what I researched, it said that they killed 1,800 people, but we know that those numbers in reality are always higher. And we see an event very similar to that happen in this book, and how the only survivor is José Arcadio II, and he tries to tell people what happened, but no one believes him. And at one point, there is an officer that says something like, "Nothing bad has ever happened here. Nothing bad is happening, and nothing bad will ever happen. This is a happy town." And I think a lot of countries can identify with that phrase, whether it is by current governments or previous ones. One of my favorite quotes appears towards the end of this novel, and it's by this character that owns a bookstore in Macondo, but decides to go back home after many years. And he sends a letter to Aureliano Babilonia and his friends because they were regular visitors. And he writes this: that wherever they might be, they always remember that the past was a lie, that memory has no return, that every spring gone by could never be recovered, and that the wildest and most tenacious love was an ephemeral truth in the end. I love this quote because I think it's a very elegant and poetic way of speaking about one of the universal truths about the importance of living in the present. Life only happens in this moment, and I think sometimes it's easy to fall for nostalgia, but we have to remember that whatever we're missing doesn't really exist anymore, and that it may be a nice memory, but we can't go back there anymore. I think that the main theme of this novel can be found in a sort of realization that Ursula has when she says that it seems like time doesn't pass, but that it turns in a circle. And I think that's what we see throughout this novel. We see time turning in a circle, and by that I mean we see cycles. We see each generation with the same names as before, behave the same way as their like ancestors, and most of all make the same mistakes. And I think that's one of the tragedies of humanity, the fact that we've found out how to pass knowledge generation to generation, but we can't really pass experience generation to generation. It seems like there are certain things that can only be lived in order to be understood. And I think that's very tragic, because it's one of the reasons that we, as both individuals and as a society, keep making the same mistake again and again. We also see that even the book itself is a cycle. When at the end, the last Aureliano is finally deciphering the book of Melquiades, and he realizes that what he's reading is the story of his family. So he's reading this story, the one that we are also reading. And at the end, when Macondo gets swept away by the wind, it disappears, as it does for us when we close the book. I think this must be one of the best endings in literature, and it's certainly one of my favorite ones. I'm sure I'm going to have to read this book a few times in order to get all the themes, and I think that's the greatness of this book. If you have any comments about what I mentioned or didn't mention, if you liked the book or if you didn't, I would love to read it. Thank you if you stayed all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!